Hello and welcome to another tutorial. This time around, I'll be showing you how to mix a UK bass or bass house style track. This is a continuation of my how to make a My New Lang type track video. So if you want to know how I made this track, then the video will be in the top right corner of the screen now. Just a reminder that I have used some processing on certain bass instruments in the sound design phase during the other video before I started composing the track, and this is particularly in terms of saturation. I'll leave some of the Ableton racks I use in this video in the description, and if you value this content, please do like and subscribe. So yeah, let's get started. Before I can start to actually mix the track, there's a few things that I've done. I've replaced the low end of the kick with a tuned kick tuned to the key of the track using this plugin called Bassism. And then I've used Span to make sure that the kick is tuned to the key of the track, which in this case is A. And then I have used EQ3 to split the frequency bands here. I've also tuned the top kick and all other pitch percussion. You can see the top kick here. I'm just going to take a look at this snare reverb layer just to make sure it's in key. So right now, the fundamental of the snare is at C sharp minus 44 cents. So we'll tune it down to C, as C is in the A minor scale. And now you can see that the snare is tuned to C6. I've also separated out the MIDI drums into individual channels so I can process these channels more evenly. And it makes the tuning process less time consuming because I could just go through them channel by channel, as opposed to having to go into the individual cells of the drum racks. For example, here we've got just the clap. The shaker and open hats are on the same channel and they are within the same choke group as well, meaning that when the shaker triggers, it'll mute the hi-hat and vice versa. This is just to make sure the high percussion sounds tight. I'll also go through the process of removing any unused inserts or plugins so that the project is less cluttered, which I've already done here. I usually color code as I go along, but if you haven't color coded up to this point, I would suggest that you do it now. So for example, I've got the drums in orange, the kick drums in a lighter orange, the bass is in yellow, leads in pink, and so on and so forth. Referencing is very important when mixing, and I will bring a reference track into the project before I start mixing. As this project is mainly based on You've Been Gone by My New Lang, it makes sense to use this track. However, although I'm trying to aim for a similar balance or gain structure, the way I utilize processing may be different, leading to a slightly different overall sound. Just make sure you turn the reference down in this case. I've turned it down by about minus 15 dB, which we can see here. The first thing I've done here is I've taken all the faders down to minus infinity. I can then start to increase the kick to between minus 10 and minus 15 dB on the fader, and then mix the drums around the kick in line with the reference track. I'll just check how the reference sounds. Sometimes you might notice resonances and irritating frequencies while you're fading the channels up, and it's not necessarily a bad thing to try and fix these immediately. I might also, in this instance, use some EQ and saturation to make the hi-hat sound a bit brighter and crunchier, because if you listen to the reference versus my hi-hats, you can hear that they're not quite as bright. and I may not be able to get them quite as bright, but you could try and use something like erosion as well. I've now faded the drums up along with the bass during the drop. Bass consistency is really important here, particularly in a section like this where I'm using multiple bass instruments. As I increase the volumes of the basses, I'm already trying to ensure they are consistent, and I'm trying to keep their levels the same, as you can see from the values here in the mixer. One approach to maintaining consistency in the low end is to use sine waves for basses and compress these sine waves heavily so they're more consistent, which is something I've done with all the basses aside from the growl bass, which I'm going to do now. As I have multiple basses here, I'm going to try and ensure that all the sine waves are compressed similar amounts. To check that the subs are consistent between the different bass instruments that I have, I will solo all the sine wave sublayers and check the meters to try and gain match the subs within 1 dB of each other. So that's what I've done here with the soloing of the sublayers. And I'm just going to check them here in the mixer. And you can see that they're all quite close, so I'll be pretty happy with that. In certain cases as well, where I've used lots of saturation, I've turned down the top layer by a few dB. And I might also use EQ in this case as well. If, for example, we listen to this garage bass, once you're happy with the drum and bass balances within the context of the reference track, and as a note here from a personal perspective, I always prefer to have the kick louder than the bass, and within the context of bass house, that makes sense because the kick is driving the rhythm. But once you are happy with the drum and bass balances within the context of the reference track, you can start to increase the volume of the leads, pads, effects, and vocals, and try and get these to your desired levels. I'm happy enough with this for now. And I'm now going to go through the process of removing unwanted frequencies from individual channels. One example of this could be removing unnecessary low frequencies from a hi-hat, which could cause muddiness in the mix. I've made sure that certain elements that are exclusively in the breakdown are 1 dB quieter. For example, this respace. So when the drop starts, there's a small increase in volume. Now we can start to group and route channels. My approach to this is to group instruments which have similar tonal properties. For example, I'm going to group this delayed shaker and the shaker and the hats together. Likewise, I'm going to group these claps and snare reverb together as well, because they both hit on the second and fourth beat and have similar tonal characteristics. Usually I will group tracks, but the channel which I sum to will be an audio channel with input enabled. So for example, for the leads, effects, pads, and vocal overall bus, it's actually just an audio channel with it on input and with it changed to no input. And these, for example, the effects bus is routed to this channel. Generally, my overall bus channels, you can see here, are normally kick, drums without the kick, bass, and then the leads, FX, pad, vocal bus that I mentioned just now. I'll also route the kick and the bass to a bus to process them together, and route this bus and the drums bus, lead, pad, and effects and vocal bus to a mix no effects bus down here. I then essentially put this channel on sends only, and I have an overall mix bus here, which I will send this mix no effects bus to. This is advantageous as it means that I can listen to all the effects on their own by muting this track if I want to. The reason that I don't process the drums, including the kicks, is that in frequency terms, the kick is much more similar to a bass than to other parts of the drum kit. I also tend to compress the drums quite heavily, and I don't really see a huge amount of point in compressing a kick drum unless you're looking for a vibe of a certain compressor, because ultimately a lot of the time it can make the kick hit with less punch. And if I want to increase the punch, then I'd use something like a transient shaper. Now we can start to mix the drums. So what I've done here with the kick is I've EQ'd out the unnecessary low end below the harmonic of the kick, and I've put it in mono to ensure it's as club compatible as it can possibly be with the high drums. The hats and shakers. I've taken out the unnecessary low frequencies. I've also used parallel compression on the drum bus. Again, I might take this down a little bit, listen to it in context. You might also notice I've EQ'd out the lows after the compressor, which means that the signal that's being compressed in parallel only contains high frequencies. The reason I've done this is because I noticed in the reference that there's a lot of kind of high frequency sizzle on the drums, and this was my attempt at replicating that. I did, however, add some J37, just using the overheads preset to add a little bit of warmth to the drums. And I'm going to mix in some reverb. Which is this short reverb on send A. So now I'm going to mix the kick and the bass instruments. What I'll do first is I'll go into the kick and bass bus. I'll just solo it. And I'll just use the transient shaper to make sure that the kicks are louder than the bass. In this case, there doesn't seem to be a huge difference between them. It's usually easier to see if you increase the volume a bit. So I'm just going to do that now. You also have to decrease it on the way out, because otherwise it's obviously a bit too loud. You can see the kicks are maybe a little bit louder, but what I'm going to try and do is make them louder still, basically. So we can take all this stuff off now. Listen to the reference. The problem with the reference here is that I think that the bass is actually a bit louder than the kick in this track. Difficult to tell. You can have a look at the waveform as well. I might just go to the bass bus. Drag in an EQ3 and turn down the 80 Hz by 1.5 dB. You'll now notice this chain, which I'm going to explain. So this is the bass bus. Again, we've EQ'd out any unnecessary rumble. I've also taken out the fundamental of the kick as well, so that there's no masking going on between the kick and the bass. Again, we've got another parallel compression rack, which is just there to glue everything together nicely. We've got another preset from the J37 from Waves. And this is my sub sidechain rack, which is again is another preset, which I will be putting down in the description. Essentially what I've done here is I've split the frequencies. So below 150 Hertz is being sidechained, but above it is not. The reason I do this is often when you use sidechain compression, particularly if you're using a fast attack, you get this click. And with this method of splitting the frequency bands with the EQ, the click seems to be eliminated. This is the best way I've kind of discovered to allow the sidechain to be tight and fast acting and not click. And it seems to work quite well. I favor quite heavy sidechain. I've got quite a fast release going on. You can kind of play with this. Generally, I want things to be quite transparent. Another reason why I use bassism as well is because of the shape of the kicks, because the kicks are very square, which means they don't really have a long tail. And that means from a functional perspective, they sidechain very well. The reason I have alloy on the kick and bass bus, aside from using it to compare the levels of the kick and the bass, is to use multi-band compression on the low end. I'm using a ratio of 3:1, and I'm just using a small amount of compression to glue the kick and bass together. Usually, this is the kind of situation where I will try and find a good spot in my studio where the bass is heaviest, so I can hear if the kick and bass sound good together, and this isn't my standard listening position. Generally, it might be in the corner of the room, for example. What I'll often do on the master bus, in terms of what I've just been talking about, is listening to just the sub-frequencies. Yeah, and that sounds nice and consistent to me. It doesn't sound like there's any real masking going on or anything like that. And I've added a bit of reverb to the bass bus as well. I've also used the same sidechain rack I've used on the bass for the drums, obviously without the kick, and the LFPV bus. A couple of notable things that I did here as well is that I brightened the organ lead a little bit, I think, with this EQ, which I got for free a few years ago. Just because the high boost helps the lead cut through the mix, especially during the drop. I also added another layer of, I've got tape saturation on this bus too, I think. Yeah, I've got the J37 on this bus as well. And again, we've got a parallel compression rack. I wanted to soften this vocal a bit more, so I used another instance of the J37 with the male vocal warmth preset. It seems to soften it very slightly. The reason that I did that was because of the bit crusher. The bit crusher adds some nasty frequencies, and I was just trying to smooth them out. Another helpful tip, which I picked up a few years ago, is that you can sidechain the effects using the kick, and this will help the kick punch through the mix even more. I've got the reverb and the delay busts to an effects bus. If we listen to them on their own, with and without the compressor, you can hear that it just helps the effects pump with the kick. And another thing I've done on the mix bus, or another thing I will do on the mix bus, or drag over from the master bus, is that in the name of mono compatibility, I have monoed everything below 200 Hertz for the entire mix. Can do it a bit lower. Again, I'm just very concerned about mono compatibility, so I want that area of the track sounding exactly the same in mono as it does in stereo. I hope this video was helpful for anyone looking to mix a bass house or UK bass style track. This is kind of the rough mix. I'll then spend a period of weeks afterwards tweaking the mix, listening on other systems, and getting feedback from others. I'll leave a mix of the track in the description so you can listen to it, along with a couple of the audio effect racks that I've mentioned and probably a couple more. Any questions or just general comments, please just leave them in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.